As I got another rhyme, another rhythm for y'all to listen. I'm never quitting on my mission, I'ma roll with what I'm giving. Got some ambition, this new edition, filling positions. Looking at the void in myself and feeling what's missing. Better watch the way you going, better go in the right direction. In the moment you stressing, but you gon' be counting blessings. And I know that for certain, keep on working, open curtains. Haters swerving, cause they ain't ready for your final version. Whoa. I'm never gonna give up, fall down, I just gotta get up, yeah.
You're listening to the Tom Ficklin Show on WNHH-LP 103.5 FM, your home for community radio.
Wanted to kind of greet everybody this morning and afternoon and evening. And I say that because literally it's tomorrow in Australia. And folks often think about, Christmas time, we just get over Thanksgiving and Eastern Standard Time, Daylight Savings Time. But I'm going to talk to Dr. Fred Mckinney in a few seconds, and just this issue of time is still fascinating me. Not to mention the time that's going on in the Middle East, but what is our place in time as a historical agents, and how do you perceive your place in this unfolding history and her story? But time kind of impacts that. I'm going to read somewhat of an extensive amount of Dr. Mckinney's background, which I normally do not do, but in terms of the Tom Ficklin Show, I've been blessed to have a lot of, an increasing number in terms of audience share of young people, folks in their teens, 20s, 30s, just getting out of college, deciding where to go to college. And Dr. Mckinney's background is so, I think, intriguing and inspirational to folks. And obviously, I think people need to know about him. Doctor, and people call him Dr. Fred, and so I'll kind of go back and forth with Dr. Fred and Dr. Fred Mckinney. But Dr. Fred, by the way, we're going to talk about Ralph Bunche also, because you're undergraduate from UCLA in connection with your thoughts on the Middle East crisis. But Dr. Fred Mckinney received his doctorate in economics from Yale University in 1983. I dare say, Dr. Fred, that in 1983, there couldn't have been more than 20 or 30 Black people to have received their doctorate in economics. I'm just saying that there weren't that many. I'm positive.
Not.
He has taught and worked at Sacred Heart University here in Connecticut, Brandeis in Massachusetts, and it's important for people to know just his extensive experience, because as I shut up after a minute or two and give him a chance to talk about the Middle East crisis, he's been around a few tracks. And so I really appreciate his being available. But Brandeis University, taught at University of Connecticut School of Business, and Dartmouth Tuck School of Business. I initially met Dr. Fred, I believe, was when you were president of the Greater New England Minority Supplier Development Council for a number of years. That's from 2001 to 2015. And I mentioned UConn and Brandeis, as I say. But also early on in his career, was a graduate assistant at the White House, Council of Economic Advisors. We don't hear so much about the Council of Economic Advisors today. They're still in existence and certainly still needed, but from 1978 to 1979. In fact, there was a Black lady that was formerly head of the Council of Economic Advisors under the Biden administration, who resigned a few months ago. And also he worked with the RAND Corporation. The RAND Corporation, summer in 1977 and 1978. I mentioned that, Dr. Fred, because we don't hear much about the RAND Corporation now, but certainly when we were in our college days and graduate school days and early professional life, the RAND Corporation's involvement with geopolitics, international politics, CIA experiments, fighting wars overseas. It's just, the RAND Corporation was kind of a people threw darts at them on the liberal side about their involvement. But you may be the spook that sat behind the door. I better shut up and let you let you now that read. But he's also operated a number of ventures pertaining to the coffee industry. We know how coffee is well, it is an addiction, but it certainly does provide some pleasure. Wanted to mention, just in conclusion, that Dr. Fred has authored 4 books and literally over 60 articles pertaining to minority business development, corporate supplier diversity, and social, economic, and political nuances. And that's why I wanted to kind of take up some of his time because he wrote an article recently in the Connecticut Post talking about this crisis in the Middle East. And my spirit tells me this is just so impactful about what the future holds for the younger folks. This issue is not going to go away, and we have to kind of, I think, educate, share, love, protest, do whatever you can as a historical agent to kind of bring peace on earth as we encounter this period between now and Christmas and Hanukkah in terms of bringing peace on earth, goodwill toward women, children, and men. Dr. Fred, welcome.
Well, thank you so much, Tom. It's great to be with you, and I've been looking forward to this call.
Walk us through a little bit of the Connecticut Post article. Sure. I was so intrigued in terms of the historical parallels, and hopefully those historical parallels won't lead to continued dead ends. But I think it's important for people to know that we may be as a society addicted to war, or we may not be able to find an anecdote. But I don't want to put words in your mouth. So talk to us about that article a little bit, if you would.
Well, first of all, when you write, and I'm not saying this was a great article or even a good article, but when you write, you are often inspired by something. And in this case, the inspiration for this article, and I write a column every other week for the Hearst Media newspapers, but this was an article that I've been thinking about ever since October 7th, when you had the Hamas attack on the Israeli citizens. And I was really frustrated with the coverage that we were getting in what's called essentially the mainstream media. And that includes, all of them.
Yes.
From the New York Times, the Washington Post, the MSNBCs, the CNNs, the Foxes. They all were very similar in the same bucket, taking a historical perspective and a very lopsided perspective on what was taking place. And specifically, there was no historical context to what we were seeing with our own eyes. And so that led me to say, I'll first admit, I am no Middle Eastern expert. But as a lifelong learner, you can learn a lot.
That's right.
Learning is possible. And if you're willing to do a little reading and other type of research, you can get a sense of where things were and how we got to where we are, and you can look at how different experts and observers are viewing things. And so I basically engaged in, I said, before I write a piece, I'm going to really engage in some research to find and to develop my perspective, so it's a more mature perspective, one that I can defend. Because I thought a lot of what I was seeing in the news was really indefensible on the part of how things were being portrayed. And then the other motivation was purely political. I was looking at, not just the troubles in Palestine and Israel, but how those things relate to what's going on here in the United States.
Yes.
In particular, we have a presidential election and a whole set of elections coming up in 2024. And, one of the leading candidates, the former president, who's been 4 times indicted, 91 counts, twice impeached, is the front runner in the other major U.S. political party, and therefore has a shot, more than what they would call a puncher's shot at winning that seat back. And I view that as an existential threat to the United States and the United States democracy, and the potential of the United States to be the type of country that it can be and should be. So here you have this intersection of a horrific long-term event that's been taking place, and it's not just October 7th, and that's what my learning really helped me to articulate and to understand better, is that this didn't start with October 7th. This goes way back. And I mean, you can keep unraveling the onion, but I really think, if you want to look at, the most recent history, you have to go back really to, the First World War.
Yes.
And understand, what was taking place in the First World War and the outcome of after the First World War, with the victory of the English, the Allied forces, over the Axis forces led by Germany, Turkey, and some other countries. And so one of the results of that was that the Ottoman Empire had been they were a colonial empire, just like other European empires and American empires. And one of the colonies that was controlled by the Ottomans, now we call the Turks, was what they called Palestine. And so with their defeat in the First World War, the British took it over. And so they kicked the Turks out and the British took it over. And, there was already simultaneous, there's a lot of stuff going on in the world. At the same time, you had, the First World War. You also had a good deal of anti-Semitism taking place at the time of the First World War and before. It was taking place more so in Russia than it was in Germany. You had lots of Jews who fought for the German army in the First World War, and they were loyal Germans. And you had American Jews who didn't want to support the Allies because Russia in the First World War was an ally to the United States. We were allies with Russia in World War I and World War II. But during that time frame, you had also the development of Zionism. And, this has been an idea for a while, but it really took hold.
Yes. And
so you had some Jewish leaders, primarily in Germany, but also in Russia and other places around Europe and America, that were looking to essentially escape from the European anti-Semitism that they were experiencing. And, they were looking for a homeland. And so where they found a place was, they were looking at three places, quite frankly. They were looking at Argentina, they were looking at Uganda, and they were looking at Palestine. They actually sent a mission, the European Zionists sent a mission to Uganda to check it out, and they concluded, no, I don't think we can live here. I mean, imagine what would have happened if they had moved to Uganda as opposed to Palestine today. But they settled on Palestine. But at that time, well, who was in Palestine? Palestinians were in Palestine at the end of the First World War. The Jews represented a very small minority of the population in Palestine. Then you can sort of fast forward to, okay, you got this Zionist movement that was a worldwide movement that was trying to get Jews from Europe primarily to move to Palestine. Fast forward to the Second World War. You have the Holocaust. Added pressure. Now anti-Semitism is focused now on the Nazis in Germany. And as a result of the Holocaust, the Jews of Europe said, many of them said, we got to get out of here,
Mm.
which was understandable.
Mm-hmm.
They wanted to escape. And so this is where the Zionist movement, the consequences of the Holocaust, the Second World War, the British takeover of Palestine, and this desire to essentially be someplace where they could, have a country of their own, or
Mm-hmm.
experience the hatred that they had experienced in Europe. Problem was, there were people in Palestine when, after the Second World War, you had large movements of Jews to Israel.
Mm-hmm.
And some of this is guilt, in my view, European guilt over their treatment of the Jews during the 30s and 40s.
Mm.
And so the UN, which comes into play now, in one of the first major acts they have is in 1947-48. They basically say, we're going to allow this state of Israel to be created.
Yes.
And so that gave it sort of a formal legal structure to create this. But as I said, there were people there. And so how do people from Europe come into this area and all of a sudden just start literally taking the land, buying the land in some cases, but often just taking the land? That created a war.
Mm-hmm.
So, so this war, goes back decades between the Zionists and the Palestinians who were there at the time the Zionists arrived.
Indeed, Dr. Fred, and when you mentioned the war, people often talk about Black history and not just being a month, but an everyday experience. But as you know, your Bruin UCLA fellow alumni,
right,
wins the
Nobel Prize.
Wins a Nobel Prize for trying to resolve this issue, Mr. Ralph
Right.
Bunche. I often ask people who Ralph Bunche is, and only 1 out of 10, 1 out of 20 people will kind of remind me. But please continue.
So this was a dilemma that I think that's the recent aspects of the dilemma, the October 7th on, which is what's in the news now, which has gotten everybody's attention. But I think you have to have a historical context,
Mm-hmm.
not to absolve anyone or any group from any act that is really counter to our sort of basic humanity.
Mm-hmm.
But you have to look at the historical context to understand what's going on and why we're seeing the things that we're seeing.
I even mentioned to folks, I'll say Andy Young, and don't people know some of what he did, and I'll say, do you remember that he was United Nations ambassador to the United Nations? And some people might say yes. Then I'll say, do you remember that he had to resign? Very few people remember that he had to resign because they're trying to reach out to Arafat and others to kind of
That's right.
to negotiate.
And so this has been a third rail of American foreign policy. The whole Israeli conflict has been a third rail if you are not jumping on the full-throated Zionist bandwagon. And so, the United States has a special relationship with the state of Israel. They are the largest recipient of U.S. foreign aid. Even before the $14 billion that Congress agreed to provide, that was requested by the Biden administration for Israel recently because of October 7th, they were receiving about almost $4 billion a year from the United States. And you say, well, what does that money buy? And so I looked into that. The money buys weapons. Okay. And so this is the deal, that we have. We, U.S. taxpayers, provide billions of dollars to Israel so they can buy weapons made by U.S. companies, weapons like you heard a lot maybe about the Iron Dome. Well, those weapons are made in the United States. The aircraft that is being used to bomb Gaza, those planes, for the most part, they have over 200 highly sophisticated airplanes made by U.S. companies. The bombs that those planes are dropping, made in the United States. So that's the deal. So we give them money. They take that money and give it back to us. And in exchange, we give them weapons. And those weapons are used right now to essentially kill Gazans by the hundreds. And so this was upsetting to me as a U.S. taxpayer. We are supporting our government is supporting something that I think that there were legitimate alternatives to how this was handled. And we're not using that influence to curtail the Israeli actions. I mean, you heard a lot about in the beginning of this current conflict that Biden was close to Netanyahu, hugging him and embracing him and saying, we support you fully. But at the same time, he was whispering in his ear, be careful, don't do this, don't do that. Well, they didn't listen. It doesn't look like they listened to any of those whisperings by the president. And here's where it comes back to sort of U.S. domestic policy. I think, and this is showing in some of the polls, it's not just Black Americans, there's a lot of Americans who don't like our dollars being used in this way. And don't see this in the one-sided way that the current administration and many in the media view it as, Israel should flatten them, essentially commit genocide.
Right.
And so I have a problem with that. I wrote in the article that, what resonates, it can resonate. You mentioned, some people may know, some people may not know. Well, they need to know. They need to know not only the connection between what's going on in Israel and Gaza and similarities between aspects of our history as Black Americans and what's going on with Gazans and Israelis. So Indeed. Black Americans, we have, I was born in Jim Crow, Arkansas in 1954. Okay, so, I experienced the Jim Crow. And what is going on in not just Gaza, but in West Bank and in Israel and in Gaza is similar to our experiences in the Jim Crow South. It's actually more similar, and I bring this up in the article, to the experiences of South Africans during the apartheid era. And so one of the main points of my article is that this, everybody's talking about we got to get back to the two-state solution. The two-state solution is the solution to this problem. And I say BS. There cannot be a two-state solution to this problem because the Zionists will not allow a two-state solution. If you look, and I encourage people to do this, look at a map of the Israel-Palestine region. Look at Gaza, look at the West Bank, look at Jerusalem, where it is. And if you look at, just focus on the West Bank for a second. If you look at the West Bank, the Zionists have essentially created settlements all throughout the West Bank. And, you think of settlements, you think, well, we got this notion of cowboys and Indians in our head. Maybe they got a little shack here and, there's a homesteader. No, these are major cities with their own urban infrastructure that are built essentially on the land that was supposed to be the Palestinian state.
Mm-hmm.
And so you now have over 200 settlements, over 500,000 Zionists living in the West Bank. So they're on the best land. And even when they're not on the best land, they take the water from the land. They control the highway. So the highways in the West Bank are like walled highways that the West Bank Palestinians can't even use.
Mm.
And so I just ask any reasonable person, where is this second state supposed to be?
Mm.
If you've got settlements of Zionists all over the place where you were going to have a country that was going to be this second state. And you've got militant settlers who essentially, walk around with AK-47s, taking pot shots at West Bank Palestinians.
Yes.
So we don't see that in the media in this country. You don't see images of the West Bank, those settlements. You don't see the areas, the Bantustans that the Palestinians have been forced to live on in the West Bank, their supposed country. And Gaza and the West Bank aren't even connected physically. So,
and I love your continuing to emphasize this historical continuum, and hopefully we'll find some solutions, perhaps not in our lifetime. I was just thinking, Dr. Fred, as you were speaking with, President Carter's wife just recently passed away, and just urge people also just to just Google President Carter and the books that he wrote after leaving office and his efforts during office about apartheid in that area of the world. You have a former president that laid his legacy out in the last 20 or so years of his life about this apartheid taking place in Israel.
Yeah, and I took a little point of personal privilege in my article because I worked at the White House from 1978 to 1979. And I started at the Council of Economic Advisors in September of 1978. Well, September of 1978 was when you had the Camp David Accords signed with President Carter and Anwar Sadat of Egypt. And Sadat paid for that agreement with his life.
That's right.
So he was assassinated about 2 years after that agreement was signed. But one of the things that they didn't, that was an agreement between Israel and Egypt to essentially not fight. And that agreement, that peace agreement, is still essentially working. So that provided some hope, and President Carter deserves a lot of credit for that. And so that's still in effect. And so Egypt and Israel have not had a war since 1978. And they were the primary protagonists in all of the previous wars, Israel and Egypt, being contiguous countries. But you haven't had that. But one of the things the Camp David Accord didn't do, and they didn't want to touch it because they knew how difficult this issue was, they didn't want to deal with the Palestinian issue because they felt that was too difficult. Let's solve the Egyptian-Israeli issue, and let's agree to come back to it. And that's where the Oslo Accords come in.
Indeed.
Okay, so that happened about 12, 13 years later.
Right.
But so that's some of that history. And again, another connection is in respect to my Native American lineage. This crisis in the Middle East is also historically reminiscent, spiritually reminiscent of the treatment of Native American nations throughout American history.
Right, and the Trail of Tears in particular.
Absolutely. So, and that wasn't the only,
Mm-hmm.
you know, essentially stealing of native land, because that's what it came down to.
Right.
And so the similarities are the same. It's about land, and whose land is it? And you know what we've seen in sort of you know, this is not just a Western thing. This is about power and military might. But the ones with the biggest guns, the most guns, are the ones who write the laws, are the
Right.
ones who essentially, you know, take the land. And that's what's happening in Palestine and Israel today. It's the ones that have the biggest guns, the most powerful weapons that are controlling the situation here. It's not about, you know, who's right or wrong. It's about who's got the guns.
Indeed, and you know, and just by nuance, you didn't articulate a wounded knee, but people might want to refer to wounded knee, or even Oklahoma was a territory before it became a state because oil was discovered. And there you had the profit motive. And so just remind people about, if you do you have the article there in front of you or in your.
I don't have it in front of me, but
the just remind people about, you quoted Andrew Jackson, and I thought that was so helpful because it's so easy for us now, 5 years, 10 years, 100 years later, to think about why did this person say this, and to impose our moral judgment and today on those people. But Andrew was speaking from the heart.
Yep.
You know, he was speaking to his audience. He wanted to remain in power. And as you say, that's the frightening thing about now, some of the folks on the other side with Nikki Haley also kind of being in the front running.
Absolutely. I will paraphrase, and I encourage your viewers, your listeners to do their own research. I tell people all the time, you don't have to believe what I say and take it. Do your own research, find out for yourself. But I knew from some earlier research that I had done that, you know, before Andrew Jackson became president, I believe it was in 1928, he was essentially the war hero, quote, war hero in the War of 1812.
Yeah, he was an Indian killer.
Indian killer.
He was branded.
But he was the general who led the fight of the final battle of the War of 1812, which was the Battle of New Orleans. And so that cemented his stature and really catapulted him to becoming sort of president a few years later. But after the War of 1812, he was involved still in the military, fighting the Seminoles in Florida. And, you know, the Seminoles were essentially made up of tribes, the Creeks, the Choctaw, some native Floridian natives, and escaped slaves. And so you had this mix of people who became the Seminoles. But Andrew Jackson said some interesting things in his correspondence while he was a general for the U.S. military fighting the Seminoles and the Spanish, because you see what was going on. Spain used to control Florida, and Spain had a different relationship with blacks. They basically told slaves, blacks in America, that if you got to Spain, if you got to Florida, you were free. And so, you know, a lot of blacks, we talk about the Underground Railroad, a lot of blacks think of the Underground Railroad going to Canada, and that's true. But if you were in South Carolina, Georgia, Alabama, your focus was getting to Florida, because you could get to Florida and be free. But the United States was fighting the Spanish and their friends, the Seminoles, to take Florida. And one of his letters back to somebody at the War Department was, and he didn't use, I'm gonna clean up his language, but he basically said, you sent me down here to fight Indians, and all I'm fighting is black people. So that's kind of revealing that, there were that many black people that, where'd they come from? They were escaped slaves who were fighting for their freedom. And so Jackson had this experience, and what I quoted was he was now president, and what I quoted was his speech to Congress when the Congress passed the Indian Removal Act.
Yes.
And the Indian Removal Act basically said, we're going to push what were called the 5 civilized tribes out of the Southeast. They can go to Oklahoma, but they got to get out of here. And so that was the Cherokees, the Choctaws, the Chickasaws, the Seminoles, and there was one other, I've forgotten the other one, but there were 5 of those quote, civilized tribes. So that was Andrew Jackson. I think it's also interesting to note that he was elected president in 1828, which was the first time that white men who didn't own property could vote for the president. You know which president? The former president, Donald Trump, whose image he kept on his desk.
Yep, he kept the bust of Andrew
Jackson. And so, he was very happy to promote Andrew Jackson.
That's right. Let's just take a deep breath for a second. So much you've shared with us, and these are such crisis times. For if you were at Brandeis now, or back at Sacred Heart, or at UConn, or even up at Tuck, or even at Quinnipiac, what would you want to say to the students? Because there certainly is evidence that we haven't solved the problem and that people have tried. Yeah. But what would you want to say to them if the student is interested in political science, or running for office, or creating a social movement, or participating in any freedom struggles? What would you like to kind of say to them so that they would not necessarily feel discouraged, but be realistic and to kind of think about their imagination and creativity for the kind of world they would like to see?
Great question. And, I've been giving this a lot of thought, and I've written about this topic as well. And, there's been many Black Lives Matter and other movements that we've experienced, the civil rights movement. But one of the common phrases that you would hear recently was no justice, no peace, right? Well, I actually think no love, no justice. And, and I think you can go back to Martin Luther King, to Gandhi, to Nelson Mandela, and understand, we're not talking romantic love here. We're talking human respect and human love. And human love doesn't allow you to pick up a gun and kill anybody. It just doesn't. Those are two inconsistent things. You don't do it. And I would encourage and challenge younger people with the notion. First of all, I would say we have failed. Our generation has failed. We have not left the world a more peaceful place than earlier generations. We have not solved what you said earlier, was this illness of violence, violence at the individual level and violence at the societal level. We have to cure that. I don't think that it is natural in the sense that we can't avoid it, because I don't buy it. And I think the real challenge that young leaders and the future generation of leaders really needs to come to terms with is, how do we promote love? And, that sounds to many people, oh, that's pie in the sky, that's, utopia, and, it's not going to happen. Who's going to do that? And, but I think that really is the only solution here. And, and I'm not a religious person. So I'm not speaking from a particular religious perspective to come to that conclusion. That just to me is common sense. That, you know, we can choose how we interact with people. What if, I mean, Israel did not have to respond the way it did after October 7th. They didn't have to do that. That was a reaction to, and an understandable reaction, but that was a reaction, and it wasn't the only possible reaction. And we have to ask ourselves that in every situation. But we have a tendency in human society to allow people to gain positions of power who are against the principles of love and justice. And that has to stop. And so that's what I would challenge it. That's what I would say to a young audience. And look at all of the conflicts at the individual level and at the societal level. That if instead of dropping a bomb, what if, you know, I was thinking about this, you can't drop cartons of milk or you know, electrical or heat to somebody who's cold, or coolness to somebody who's hot, or water to somebody who's thirsty, or food to somebody who's hungry. But what if we respond in that manner, in giving, as opposed to killing? And what would happen? I mean, what would have happened if Israel had said, okay, we're not going to bomb Gaza. We're going to help Gaza. Now, internally, they would say, no, that's crazy. We got to go get them. They did us wrong. We got to do them wrong. But what if they had taken a different approach? How would could that have brought healing?
Yes.
And that's what Mandela did.
And you're absolutely right. The number of journalists that have been killed in this recent conflict, and the number of UN employees that just really kind of, not separate apart from the hostages, et cetera, and the thousands of people that have died so far. I don't necessarily want to end on a somber note, but I do want to go to 2024, because this next 14 or so months, 13 months are going to, from the media standpoint, from the confusion, from the chaos, from people's psychic positions in their lives, it's a treacherous slope. And I just like to remind folks that I call the former president 145th. 145th won more votes than any sitting president before he lost. Biden received more votes, but 145th received more votes than any previous incumbent president. So just remind people that army of his loyal devotees, or his disciples, are still out there, as we can see in some of these various polls. But it's very scary. Many academics have talked. You mentioned Argentina. Argentina just had a right-wing election. Holland. A recent, small countries, but we can see this wave. So whether we're repeating 1938, whether we're going to appeasement, or whether we're going to try to move forward. Lastly, there's a book, a Yale Law School professor, about what America taught Hitler. What America taught Hitler.
Absolutely.
So let's share a little bit. I want to give you a chance to kind of think in your mind, and these, put yourself in the White House right now, and also from the students, and even from an economic development standpoint, just the impact of oil. You reference World War I, and you could have just spoke for another 50 minutes about the oil, and books by Daniel Yergin, et cetera. And we're dealing with this oil issue even now. And some people suggest that the Hamas response was in reaction to Israel and Saudi Arabia beginning the talk. So I want to give you for the next 10 or so minutes as we conclude, just whatever related thoughts that you might have in terms of where you are personally, emotionally, but also where you see things people, what do you think people should think about, discuss, have a group about, research, because if you're eligible, even if you're not eligible to vote in next year, this is going to be very, very fascinating.
Yeah. Well, thank you for that. I encourage, again, as I said earlier, I encourage people to do research. What we have now, and this is where technology has advanced significantly.
Yes.
Since you and I were in college. There's a lot more information at our fingertips. And I'm excited about the ability to learn efficiently. That's possible now. And I really encourage young people to literally ask questions and to expose themselves to multiple points of view. And so not to just, and that's one of the problems that we have in our culture today, is that, you know, we have kind of gone into camps. You got this group and that group, and this group doesn't understand that group, and vice versa. And this group has its news and that group has its news, and those things are just very different. Well, I think if you're going to be a mature intellect, you've got to be able to hold up more, as I said, it's been said before, you got to be able to hold up more than one idea at a time. And consider multiple ideas, and one may be better than the other. But you come to that conclusion based on your own research, your own analysis. And so, I think that's possible at a young age. And, you know, that's not what we're doing. So I think as a Black man in America, I would like to spend more of my remaining time really providing educational support, intellectual support to young people, so that they will be better equipped to navigate this very complex world. Because, you know, you have some choices here. We have choices. You can just kind of digest what's been told to you and accept it and go on, and you know, you might have a fairly uneventful life, right? Or you can, you know, look at all of the information that you're observing and seeing, and ask questions like, well, how can we improve things?
Indeed.
And that's where I think that only comes from people who are curious, who are intellectually curious, who really want to know how things are working, or why they are why certain things are happening the way they're happening. So I'm excited about that potential to reach young people in ways that we couldn't do 30, 40 years ago. And things like what you're doing on this podcast is something that we didn't have available to us. You know, if you wanted to learn something, you went to school and that was it. So, or you read this paper, because you had one paper in town usually. And that was your source of information. This was pre-internet. Now you can choose. And so, you know, I've been telling a lot of my friends and family on this particular issue of the Middle East, and really almost any other thing. But let's look at this particular issue in the Middle East. I tell people, you know, watch the mainstream media, get their perspective, but also go to Al Jazeera and see what they're saying. And what you'll see on Al Jazeera is not what you're going to see on MSNBC or CNN or Fox. You're going to see reporters. You mentioned the reporters that have lost their lives. Well, those are the Al Jazeera reporters that are losing their lives. And the media from other outlets CNN and those other companies, they're not in Gaza, except with the Israeli army holding their hand.
Right.
So they're not seeing what's going on. So you got to see for yourself and then begin to ask questions. And so there's a lot of information out there. You just have to be curious enough to go look for it. So
let's wind up if we could, Dr. Fred. Just I want to take you way back, but also current, because when someone earns a PhD in any subject matter, they don't forget that they went through that arduous process.
That's right.
You've earned your PhD in economics, and certainly you have to think. You have an economic lens for the future for young folks. I'm not going to ask you where society is going, and I'm not going to ask you about artificial intelligence or Oculus or anything. But this is certainly a new day. Any pearls of wisdom for folks that are, graduating, starting to get married, just in terms of their economic stability, because much of what you've written and studied is about political forces impact economic force. In fact, some people talk about political economy as being the phrase rather than just politics. So
yeah, for folks getting started, I would actually advise them. Public Enemy had a song called "Don't Believe the Hype." And so, and one of the things that I would encourage young people who are starting out and concerned about their financial health and their ability to generate wealth is, wealth starts not with consumption, but with savings and investment. That's how you generate wealth. And so you have a choice. You can consume or you can save. You can do both, but there's a trade-off. The more consumption that you have, the less savings you can have. The less savings you have, the less you have for investment. And so that's the formula. That's the formula for an individual. That's the formula for a country. So our economic growth as a country depends on how much money we as a country can save and invest in our future. And that's really the purpose of wealth, is to have the money so that you can consume more in the future. And so I would encourage young people, manage their consumption, manage their desires, and try to, again, going back to intellectual curiosity, why do you want that? Why do you want that? Why is it better? I mean, we're all guilty of it. I buy stuff. I'm not saying, become a hermit, but you really got to ask yourself, why do you buy what you buy? And what do you need? And what do you want to give to your successors? Be that your children or the community that you want to provide for.
I appreciate that. It just occurred to me, Dr. Fred, just as you were talking, I don't always do this, but we've known one another, and I think you'll allow me to, if not throw a fastball at you, maybe not a curveball, maybe not a forkball, but you have two children that are involved with careers that I think kind of illustrate how we can use our imagination, be professional, be successful, be contributing to society. You don't need to mention their names, of course, but share with folks the two fields that they're in. I think that would be helpful for you.
Absolutely. I'm very proud of my children and their spouses. So my son is my oldest, and he went out. Sometimes as children, you don't want to follow in your parents' footsteps. Particularly, there's always this history of fathers and sons.
Yes.
And I, if I'd had my choices, before he was born, I would say it'd be great if he could, become a better economist than me, get a PhD and do better than I did, because I was in that first generation of Black economists that were coming out. And I would have loved for him to be a PhD economist. Well, he didn't become a PhD economist, but he became a close second. He's a PhD sociologist. Okay. And he's doing great work. And he is in many respects a much better scholar than I am. and I'm very proud of him. My daughter is on the faculty at Harvard, and she's an architect, and she's doing great work. And they I'm proud of both of them, and I mentioned their spouses. My son's wife is a rheumatologist, a physician. My daughter's husband was just nominated by the President Biden, to be the #2 person at the Peace Corps.
Indeed.
And so, they're on they're on a path that I couldn't be prouder of. And if I were to give any advice, people ask, well, how did your children do so well in school, etc. And I think, a lot of it is luck, perhaps. Some people might say, I got prayer or whatever. But I'll tell you a little. I mean, you see behind me, I got a lot of books.
Yes.
And that's not nearly all of them. But when my kids were growing up, and we got different kinds of things going on now, but we would spend our Saturdays and Sundays often at Barnes and Noble. And we'd go in, and I'd say, okay, you guys, we're gonna stay here. We're gonna be here for a couple of hours. You go, read, look, and do anything you want, and you can pick 2 things, and we'll get that for you. And so they, from a very early age, developed an appreciation for books. They saw me reading. They saw my wife reading. And we were readers. And so that's, I think, one of the critical things for their success.
Excellent. And I'm going to throw in, as we conclude, Dr. Fred, again, on the personal note, when you mention love, and people have so many different interpretations of agape love and agape love and political love and personal love and platonic love. But when I've seen you in the past with your mother, and right beside her side, that's love incarnate for me. So
absolutely,
I guess you may not be denominationally defined, but you're part of the love pantheon. So thanks to you. Thanks for kind of taking the time this afternoon, and I'm sure we'll hopefully lay eyes on one another in person soon, as the old folks would say.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Tom.
Thank you, Dr. Fred.
Okay.
Be well.
All right. You too.
As I got another rhyme, another rhythm for y'all to listen. I'm never quitting on my mission. I'ma roll with what I'm giving. Got some ambition, this new edition, filling positions. Looking at the void in myself and feeling what's missing. Better watch the way you going, better go in the right direction. In the moment you stressing, but you gon' be counting blessings. And I know that for certain. Keep on working, open curtains. Haters swerving, cause they ain't ready for your final version. Whoa. I'm never gonna give up. Fall down, I just gotta get up, yeah.
You're listening to the Tom Ficklin Show on WNHH LP 103.5 FM, your home for community radio.